Holding the acceptance letter in my hands, I almost burst into tears. No one in the world could possibly understand the truth hidden inside me that I had been reborn. At the very last moment of my previous life, when despair had already crushed me, I had changed my choice of school and applied instead to the University of Southern California, far away on the West Coast. It felt unreal, as if fate had given me one more chance to escape. Even Professor Harold Jennings, my homeroom teacher, had been surprised. He raised his brows when he saw my application. "Didn't you say your fiancé would be teaching at the academy nearby? If you go so far away, will he wait for you?" At the mention of Anthony Sullivan, an image flooded my mind, a tall, disciplined, striking young man, with the sharp presence of someone destined for a military career. To everyone around us, I had never truly measured up to Anthony. He was handsome, ambitious, already a promising officer at the United States Military Academy at West Point, while I had been the ordinary girl tethered to him only because of an engagement arranged when we were still children. In their eyes, I owed my place beside him, not to worth or merit, but to an outdated promise made between two families. I smiled faintly, though my heart burned. "Professor, isn't this the era of free-love childhood engagements are just relics of an old tradition? They don't mean anything anymore." He had not expected such words from me. He looked at me with surprise, then slowly nodded, even patted my shoulder with an approving gleam in his eyes. But what could I tell him? That in my previous life, I had never even walked through the gates of a university. That just days before I was supposed to enter college, I was instead preparing to marry Anthony Sullivan. Very soon afterward, I had become pregnant and school slipped away from me forever. For a short while, Anthony lingered near campus, but eventually he entered active duty, marching steadily along the brilliant path of his military career. And I remained behind, confined to a small apartment on the Upper East Side, watching my youth wither away inside military housing, raising our child, caring for his parents, and burying myself in years of silent sacrifice. Anthony thrived in uniform, each posting lifting him higher. And wherever he went, Claudia Pearson, the charming singer from the entertainment troupe, and her little girl Faith always seemed to follow. Rumors swirled, but I swallowed them down, busying myself with endless chores with scraped knees and fevers, with the exhaustion of raising a son mostly on my own. I held my boy close when he was small, his tiny hands gripping mine as though he would never let go. But as he grew older, step by step, he drifted away from me and toward Anthony, until the day came when I discovered too late that he had married Claudia's daughter. I hadn't been invited, hadn't even known. I only saw the wedding photo when it appeared on the social media page of an old acquaintance. In that picture, my son knelt gracefully, offering tea to his new mother-in-law, while Anthony stood beside Claudia, their faces shining radiant, so tender with each other that it sliced through my chest like a blade. Later, my son returned more than once to tell me I should divorce his father. "Mom," he said bluntly, "Dad has suffered his whole life. If it weren't for you, he would have been with her long ago. You and Dad don't belong together. Why can't you just let go?" Even my daughter-in-law refused to see me. I was invisible in my own family. But how could I let go? I couldn't forget the nights I had stayed awake tending to Anthony's sick parents, their feeble bodies heavy in my arms, while he laughed and charmed Claudia somewhere else. I couldn't forget the time my little boy burned with fever at midnight, and I ran barefoot for miles to find a doctor while Anthony sat comfortably at Claudia's table, helping Faith with her homework. I couldn't forget the career I abandoned, the dreams I sacrificed, the years of youth I gave away, all for this family that rewarded me with scorn. And then after everything they all told me, I was the one who didn't measure up, that I had clung too tightly, that I should have released him long ago. The bitterness carved lines into my face turned me into a hollow woman before my time. Still, I swore to myself if death took me, I would drag them into the abyss with me. Whether they ended up together afterward no longer mattered. My heart had turned to stone. In the end, it was my son again who drove the final nail into my coffin. He begged me to divorce Anthony, his words sharp, insistent, cutting me down, until silence was my only answer. At last he grew angry, turned away, and stormed out. He never looked back. He never saw me clutching my chest, the searing pain exploding inside as I called his name. He never saw me fall. He only slammed the door behind him, leaving me to die alone. And in those final moments, regret consumed me. Why had I endured it all for him? Why had I thrown away my entire life, yet somehow mercifully, fate returned me to the beginning, to the days before the wedding, with one more chance to choose differently. When I returned home from receiving my acceptance letter, I hid it carefully, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. Then I moved into the kitchen and began to cook, the familiar rhythm of stirring and chopping a thin veil over the storm inside me. The apartment had 2 bedrooms and a modest living room, government-issued housing for Anthony's military family. As the meal simmered, I walked into the living room, picked up the calendar hanging on the wall, and circled in bright red the date of my enrollment at USC. I stood there a long time staring at the number, my breath unsteady, my lips trembling with the words I dared not speak aloud. Just a little longer, only a few more weeks. Then finally I would be free. I stared at the date circled in red on the calendar, my heart swelling with a strange mix of fear and anticipation. It was so close now, just a few more weeks, and freedom would finally be mine. The thought alone made my pulse quicken, like a bird fluttering in a cage that suddenly saw the open sky. I had just finished cooking when the door opened. As if scripted by fate, Anthony Sullivan stepped inside, tall and straight in his uniform, his presence filling the small apartment. But behind him, like a shadow that refused to leave, came Claudia Pearson, with her little daughter Faith in tow. Claudia wore her usual smile, soft and demure on the surface, but her eyes gleamed with something sharper, something meant only for me. "Sorry to bother you again, Brooke," she said with an air of false modesty, her voice sugar-coated yet laced with an unmistakable satisfaction. She was dressed in a deep red coat that clung to her frame, her pale skin glowing, her beauty impossible to ignore. Faith, already too comfortable in this home, darted past me with a squeal, rushing straight to the table as if she owned the place. I watched silently as the little girl helped herself to the food I had just prepared. She filled a bowl for herself, one for Anthony, and one for Claudia, her small hands moving with the entitlement of someone who had done this many times before. Only one bowl was missing, mine. By the time I stepped out of the kitchen, the 3 of them were already seated, laughing together, their voices warm and intimate, a picture-perfect family. A family in which I had no place. Then came the moment of truth. They took their first bites, and immediately all 3 of them grimaced, spitting the food out. Faith scrunched her nose. "It's too salty," she cried, her little voice sharp. I leaned quietly against the kitchen doorway, my face calm, though inside my heart churned. Anthony scrambled to save the situation, ladling soup into their bowls, but when they tasted it, the broth was even saltier. Tears welled in Claudia's eyes as she clutched her daughter, dramatically rising from the table. "It seems Brooke doesn't welcome us here," she whispered, her tone trembling with wounded dignity. "We won't trouble you again." Her gaze lingered on Anthony, as if seeking his protection, her eyes glistening with grievance. Anthony rushed to walk them to the door, his hand brushing gently against Claudia's elbow, as if she were fragile glass. When he returned, his eyes narrowed on me. "Did you do that on purpose?" His voice was low, threaded with disbelief. I said nothing, only turned back toward the kitchen and began reheating the vegetables. Silence was my shield. He sighed heavily, his voice softer now. "Claudia's husband asked me to look after them before he died. It's not what you think. And Faith really does like your cooking." He paused as if waiting for a reaction. None came. Finally, he threw up his hands in surrender. "Fine. If it bothers you that much, I won't invite them again." But we both knew those words were empty. The next morning, after Anthony left for duty, I pulled out my suitcase. My heart raced as I folded clothes, tucked away books, and gathered the remnants of my life here. The engagement between us had never been a matter of love. It was an arrangement, a promise made by our families, long ago sealed with gifts and tokens of good faith, even measured by astrological charts. If I wanted to end it, I couldn't just walk away. I needed witnesses' signatures and the acknowledgement of the community back home so that no one could bind me to him again. While sorting through my things, I found items that had followed me for years: hand-stitched quilts, pillowcases, a pair of shoes I had sewn myself. My fingers lingered on them, heavy with memories. With a deep breath, I gathered them into a cloth bag and carried them to the pawn shop at the end of the street. The man behind the counter barely glanced at the careful stitches before naming a price: $30. Years of labor, of quiet devotion, reduced to a handful of crumpled bills. Still, I accepted. To me now, every single dollar mattered. College in Los Angeles would not be easy. There would be tuition, food, rent, travel. All of it would cost money, and I needed to guard every cent. Back home, I grabbed the red pen once more and drew a bold line across the calendar. 20 days. Just 20 more days until I could leave this place and begin anew. That evening, Anthony returned late. The dinner I had left out for him sat untouched, the rice gone cold. He loosened his tie, dropping into a chair with practiced ease. I ate at the academy, he explained casually, as though it were of no importance. But the faint trace of perfume clung to him, not the harsh cologne of soldiers, but something softer, delicate, the unmistakable fragrance of white tea. A scent I had smelled once before in Claudia. My chest tightened. He hadn't simply eaten at the academy. He had taken Claudia and Faith out instead, sparing them the awkwardness of dining here, where I might make them uncomfortable. It was thoughtful, considerate, just not toward me. I said nothing, merely cleared the untouched dishes and returned to my room. Books and test papers towered, high relics of my high school years, stacked so tall that I had no choice but to leave some outside in the living room. I bent down, gathering armfuls of them, binding them tightly with twine. Tomorrow, when Anthony was gone again, I would finish packing. Whatever belonged to me, I would take with me. I would leave nothing here. This apartment, this life, it no longer had any claim on me. As I folded the last of my books into neat stacks, I heard a knock at the door. My chest tightened instantly. I knew it was Anthony Sullivan. For as long as I had lived under his roof, he had been almost unnervingly polite, never crossing into my room without permission, never breaching the invisible line of courtesy between us. I froze my suitcase half open on the floor, unwilling to let him see me preparing to leave. "What is it?" I called, trying to keep my tone calm, casual, though my fingers clenched tightly around the handle of my suitcase. There was silence for a long moment. Then his voice came, muffled but steady. "I'm filling out the marriage report. Do you think June 9th works for the wedding date?" The words landed like stones in my stomach. June 9th. The exact day I had married him in my previous life. I glanced at the packed luggage by my bed and felt a cold calm sweep through me. "Marriage is a serious matter," I replied evenly. "I'll ask my relatives back home for their opinion first." Silence stretched again, long and heavy. Eventually, I heard his footsteps retreat down the hall. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, leaning back against the headboard. With his rank and position, Anthony didn't need my family's approval at all. A report filed at his academy was enough to seal the union. My parents had passed away years ago. It was only because of the childhood engagement that his parents had taken me in, raising me, as though I already belonged to their household. In the eyes of outsiders, I was practically his wife already. The wedding ceremony would have been nothing more than a formality. Anthony was everything the world admired: handsome, accomplished, disciplined, steady. And he had treated me well enough that people assumed I loved him, that I longed to be his wife. And for a time in my first life, I had. I had believed myself in debt to the Sullivan family for taking me in, and I had tried to repay it with loyalty, devotion, and silence. But that lifetime had taught me the futility of such sacrifice. I had given everything, and in the end, I had been left with nothing. Not this time. In this life, I owed no one. I would walk my own path, a path that no longer included Anthony Sullivan. The next morning, I awoke to the unexpected scent of food. When I entered the kitchen, Anthony was there standing over the stove with a kind of awkward earnestness. On the table sat two simple dishes: scrambled eggs sunny side up and a bowl of rice porridge studded with dried fruit and nuts. The very meal I favored most. In 3 years of living here, I had never once seen him cook. We sat across from each other in silence, the clink of spoon against bowl, the only sound. I kept my eyes on my food, unwilling to let my heart falter. Halfway through the meal, he looked up suddenly. "I took leave," he said. "I'll drive you back home for a visit." I nearly dropped my spoon. "No," I blurted out, shaking my head. "That isn't necessary." His brows knit together. "It's not safe for you to travel alone. I'll go with you." I scrambled for an excuse, but before I could find one, the door burst open and a small figure came running in. Faith Pearson, her hair tied up in 2 pink bows, dashed straight into Anthony's arms, squealing, "Dad." The word stabbed into me like ice. Anthony bent instinctively, catching her and holding her close. "Faith, why are you here? Where's your mother?" The little girl pressed her face into his chest, sneaking a glance at me before mumbling. "Mom said you don't like her, so she was scared to come." Her voice was tiny, trembling with practiced innocence. I stared at her, and for a moment the world blurred. In my previous life, after I had become Anthony's wife, this girl had grown into the woman my son adored. Faith Pearson had never once faced me directly, had never acknowledged me, yet she had been exalted like a goddess in their home. Even at 3 years old, she carried herself with a confidence far beyond her age, a little woman already with eyes too sharp for her tender face. Anthony didn't hesitate. The moment Faith whispered that Claudia wasn't feeling well, he rose, scooping her into his arms, his entire being focused only on her. He didn't even glance back at me as he rushed out the door, leaving me with the echo of their footsteps. A hollow laugh escaped my lips. "So much for needing an excuse," I whispered to myself. He had provided me with the perfect one. With him gone, I wouldn't need to refuse him outright. I could simply slip away. I went back to the calendar, red pen in hand, and drew another harsh line across the number 1. 19 days left. 19 days until I would finally break free. I spent the afternoon bundling my notebooks and test papers, all the lessons and exams from high school that had once been my lifeline. I stacked them in the living room, tied tightly with rope, preparing to sell them off in bulk. Every penny counted now. Later, with $13 tucked into my pocket, I stood at the edge of the road, my suitcase by my side, ready to begin the journey back to my hometown in upstate New York. This time, I would end the engagement with Anthony Sullivan once and for all. His family had never treated me poorly, but convincing them would not be difficult. Would tell them the truth as they wanted to hear it, that Anthony was destined for greatness, that he deserved a wife who matched his future, and that I, plain Brooke Evans, was not worthy. They would accept it. They would let me go. When I arrived, the air of my hometown was heavy with silence. The small courtyard behind my relative's house smelled of smoke from a low fire burning in the center, the thin light flickering against the earthen walls. I sat on the steps, slicing herbs into thin strands on a worn wooden board, the rhythm steady grounding me. Uncle Charles and Aunt Margaret Evans sat nearby, watching me with somber faces. After a long silence, Uncle Charles sighed deeply, shaking his head. "Brooke," he said slowly, "whatever feelings he may or may not have, you and Anthony have an engagement. A promise is a promise." Uncle Charles's voice was steady, though I could hear the frustration lacing through every word. "If Anthony dares not to marry you, Brooke, I'll go straight to his academy and settle it with him myself. Your parents asked us to look after you before they passed. How can you be so stubborn?" His eyes softened, then filled with both worry and resignation. "Come on, we're going to the courthouse." I followed them quietly, my heart pounding with each step. The small local courthouse in our upstate New York town felt cold and weighty, its worn wooden benches carrying decades of whispered confessions and heavy verdicts. A judge presided over our case, his spectacles slipping down the bridge of his nose as he wrote the annulment certificate. Several elders from the community stood as witnesses, their lined faces grave. At last, the engagement that had bound me to Anthony Sullivan since childhood was officially dissolved. We exchanged back the tokens of betrothal that had chained our futures together, and with that, the ties were severed. When it was done, I let out a long, shaky breath, feeling a strange lightness settle over me. I supported Uncle Charles and Aunt Margaret as we walked home together. They had only ever wanted what was best for me, and I understood that. By every logical measure, Anthony was a prize. An officer with a brilliant future, a man admired by his peers. Even his parents could not fathom why I would insist on breaking the match. But how could I explain? How could I confess that in another life, I had already endured decades of pain, humiliation, and betrayal? Because of this very arrangement, I could not tell them that the son I had raised with every ounce of love in me had turned out not to be mine at all, that he had belonged to Claudia Pearson, nurtured by Anthony's affection, until he became part of their family, while I was left to wither away in solitude. I could not tell them that I had died alone, abandoned, forgotten. The truth was locked inside me. And so I smiled instead. The engagement was gone. At last, the Sullivan family held no claim over me. Uncle Charles and Aunt Margaret told me gently that from now on, I would be their daughter, not merely their niece. My throat tightened at their words. I did not tell them about USC, about the life awaiting me in Los Angeles. Instead, I lingered with them for 2 weeks, cherishing the quiet moments, helping Aunt Margaret with chores, listening to Uncle Charles talk about the harvest. When the day came for me to leave, they walked me all the way to the edge of the village. Aunt Margaret's hand clung to mine as she reminded me again and again. Remember, this is your home. Don't forget to come back. Their figures grew smaller as I walked toward the bus stop, and only when I reached into my bag did I realize they had slipped $200 inside their silent blessing pressed into my palm. Tears blurred my vision, spilling freely down my cheeks, unstoppable. Back in Manhattan, the first thing I did was seize my red pen and slash 15 bold strokes across the calendar. Only 4 days left. Just 4 more days until I would leave this life behind. I was carrying my suitcase into my room when the door swung open. Anthony had returned from work. My chest tightened as I realized he wasn't alone. Claudia Pearson trailed after him, her elegance flawless, her face calm and composed. Little Faith skipped at her side, her ribbons bouncing as she darted past me. "You're back," Anthony said, his tone tinged with surprise, as his gaze flickered over me. Claudia merely nodded with practiced grace before walking straight into my bedroom. I froze. She closed the door behind her with the ease of someone who believed she belonged there, as though my space had never been mine at all. My belongings were still scattered in the living room, half-packed and waiting. Anthony followed my eyes, his expression faltering as though only now remembering. He cleared his throat. Claudia's apartment had water damage after the storm last week. I told her she and Faith could stay here for a couple of days. You weren't home and there wasn't much of your stuff in the room, so I let them use it. His words sliced through me. So as long as I wasn't present, my space, my existence could be erased, without a second thought. Seeing the silence on my face, he added hastily, "Don't worry, I moved your things into my room. You can stay there with me." He opened the door to his bedroom, gesturing inside. As though this were a simple, reasonable arrangement. "By the way, where are all your books? You used to have piles of them. Why do you only have this little bag?" He placed my small suitcase gently on the nightstand, waiting for an answer. I pressed my lips together. "The exams are over. There's no point in keeping them. I sold them." My voice was flat, detached. Anthony frowned. "Even so, you might have used them again someday." Why sell everything? His puzzlement hung in the air, but I refused to explain. He shifted uncomfortably, then changed the subject. "What did your family say about the wedding?" I hesitated only briefly before answering, my tone deliberately vague. "Someone checked the calendar. They said that date isn't good. We'll need to choose another time." It was the excuse Uncle Charles and I had agreed upon stalling for as long as possible until I could disappear for good. Anthony didn't seem to doubt me. He simply nodded slowly, murmuring, "Then we'll look at another day." With that, he turned away, heading toward the kitchen. "You've traveled a long way. Rest for now. I'll cook dinner." I sank into the chair by the window, my eyes drawn to the desk. There, half hidden beneath a stack of papers, lay the marriage report Anthony had been drafting. His neat handwriting filled the page, every detail, already completed, only the date left blank. My breath caught in my throat. It was all so real, so close, as though the future I had once endured was poised to repeat itself. But this time, I clenched my fists and told myself firmly, not again. On the marriage report, every detail had already been carefully filled out. My name, his, our dates of birth, our addresses, everything in neat black ink. Only the space for the wedding date remained blank. My heart lurched as I realized I had been staring at it too long, as if hypnotized by the inevitability of it all. I forced myself to look away, rising from the chair, ready to escape into the kitchen and busy myself with dinner. But before I could take a step, laughter and voices drifted in from outside the apartment door. A man's low voice, a woman's lilting tone, the bubbling chatter of a child. All of it wove together in a harmony that sliced through me. I sank back down into my chair, suddenly exhausted. The truth weighed on me like lead. The engagement had already been dissolved, and yet here we were still living under the same roof. Worse still, Anthony had moved my belongings into his room, as if the two of us sharing a bedroom could erase the fact that we were no longer bound by promise or love. 4 days. That was all I had left. There was no time to find a new place to stay, no way to vanish completely before I was ready. I would simply have to endure. Tonight, I told myself I would sleep on the couch in the living room. The journey back from my hometown had left me drained. My body ached from the long ride, and all I wanted was to collapse into sleep. But Claudia Pearson seemed to thrive in the late hours. She had changed into a flowing white dress and was now twirling gracefully across the living room floor, stretching and bending, her movements practiced and elegant. She even rolled out a mat in the center of the room to perform splits, humming softly, as though this were her private studio. Meanwhile, Faith ran wild, darting in and out of Anthony's bedroom with the unrestrained energy of a child who knew she belonged. I watched from the doorway as she bounced on his bed, as though it were a trampoline, her giggles echoing through the apartment. The sight tightened something inside my chest until I could hardly breathe. Finally, I couldn't bear it anymore. I grabbed a basin and muttered an excuse about needing water to wash my face. Out in the hallway, the night air cooled my skin. I inhaled deeply, forcing calm into my lungs. "Brooke, you're back already," a familiar voice called. I turned to see Mrs. Howard, our neighbor from next door, carrying her own basin. She fell into step beside me as we headed toward the communal tap at the end of the block. "Didn't you say you'd be gone longer, visiting your relatives upstate?" "I was away a few days," I said quietly. "I only just returned." Mrs. Howard was the accountant's wife, well off compared to most families here. She often shared pastries or fried treats with me. Small gestures of neighborly kindness that I had always appreciated. She glanced at me now as though she wanted to say something, then abruptly tightened her grip on my arm and pulled me a little faster down the path. At the pump, she set down her basin with a loud clatter and jabbed a finger at my forehead. "Foolish girl," she scolded, her voice sharp with indignation. "What were you thinking, letting a woman like that into your home? Her husband barely cold in the ground, and she's already making herself comfortable with yours." Her words burned, but she didn't stop. "You think you're the only one who doesn't see it? Every man in Anthony's unit despises her. Every woman sees her for what she is. A snake in silk. And you let her walk through your front door and take root. My God, Brooke, are you blind?" I stood still, listening as she unleashed her fury. It wasn't until she had run out of breath that I learned the truth. Anthony had been telling people outside that it was me who had insisted Claudia and Faith stay with us. He had claimed that I, out of pity, had urged him to take them in while their apartment was under repair. A bitter laugh escaped me. So that was it. He had thrown me in front of the bullet to shield himself from gossip, sacrificing my reputation to protect Claudia. How convenient, how cowardly, but what did it matter now? I would be gone in days. There was no point in defending myself. So I only smiled faintly. My lips curved with scorn and said nothing. On the walk back, Mrs. Howard didn't stop muttering, warning me over and over again that women like Claudia needed to be driven out before they destroyed everything. She even offered her help if I needed it, swearing she would stand by me. I knew she partly wanted the drama, the spectacle, but beneath it, her intentions weren't cruel. When I returned to the apartment, the living room was silent. Claudia and Faith were nowhere in sight. Relief washed over me as I grabbed a change of clothes and stepped into the bathroom. But the moment I opened the door, I froze. The space had been transformed. My soap dish and face towel had been shoved into a corner, carelessly placed beside the trash. In their place were a pair of plush bath towels, one large, one small, along with bottles of shampoo, conditioner, hair clips, and lotions that were not mine. The smell of unfamiliar perfume lingered in the air. This was no longer my bathroom. It was theirs. Before I could react, a sudden shove from behind sent me stumbling forward, my head striking the door frame. Stars burst across my vision. "Step aside," Brooke Claudia's voice floated in sweet and soft, though her arms were full with Faith. "She needs to use the bathroom." She brushed past me as though I were invisible, carrying Faith into the room with her. I stood rigid in the doorway, my breath-shaking fury rising in my chest. When Claudia emerged again, she tilted her head at me, her smile gentle, but her eyes glinting with quiet triumph. "Brooke, would you mind moving a little? You're blocking the way." Her tone was silk, but I caught the flicker of mockery hidden beneath it. For once I didn't step aside. I lifted my chin, locking eyes with her, my voice cold and even. "Apologize." Her smile faltered. Claudia had not expected me to stand my ground. She had always assumed I would bow, swallow my pride, and move aside. But she wasn't alone. Her daughter Faith had long since learned how to tip the balance. The little girl had never liked me. The moment she saw me challenging her mother, she lunged forward, her tiny hands shoving me with surprising force. Then came the piercing wail, shrill and practiced, echoing through the entire apartment. "You're mean. You're hurting my mom. You're a bad person." Faith shrieked, her tears streaming as if she had been gravely wronged. Within seconds, Anthony rushed from his room, his expression tense. "What happened? What's going on?" Claudia lowered her gaze, her lashes damp with feigned tears, her voice trembling with just the right amount of sorrow. "It was my fault. Faith had to use the bathroom so urgently, and Brooke was inside. I only asked her to let us through. That's all. But..." She let her words trail delicately, leaving the rest to Anthony's imagination. I could see the judgment flash in his eyes as he turned toward me. He said nothing, but the look spoke volumes. Then he crouched beside Faith, softening instantly. "Shh, sweetheart, don't cry. It's okay. Daddy will have Brooke apologize. How about that?" He lifted her into his arms, her sobs muffling against his chest, and carried her back to his room. "I'll get you some candy," he promised, as Claudia lingered at the doorway, casting me one last smug, triumphant smile before following him inside. The sound of Faith's cries gradually faded, leaving the apartment heavy with silence. I stood rooted for a moment, then turned away, my face blank. I washed, gathered my belongings into a basin, and retreated to my room. By the time I returned, Claudia and Faith were gone. A small box of colorful candy sat neatly on the nightstand, placed there, as if to remind me of who the true mistress of the home was. Anthony glanced up as I entered, his voice edged with authority. "Sit down. I didn't need to hear the rest." I already knew what was coming, the lecture about how children didn't know any better, how I should forgive, how I ought to apologize to Faith for frightening her. I sat, but not to be scolded. Instead, I pulled a tissue from my pocket, dabbed it against the tender spot on my forehead, where the doorframe had cut my skin, then placed the blood-stained paper directly in front of him. The crimson mark bloomed starkly against the white, impossible to ignore. Anthony froze, his words caught in his throat. His face shifted through shades of disbelief, discomfort, and shame until he finally looked away. I said nothing. I simply lifted my pillow and walked to the door. "I'll sleep on the couch tonight," I said flatly. "Wait." His hand shot out, gripping my wrist. "The bed is empty. Why would you sleep out there?" He thought I was still sulking. He sighed heavily, as though I were a child to be coaxed. "Faith is just a little girl. She doesn't understand. And Claudia, she didn't mean any harm. You're the adult here, Brooke. Don't hold it against them. Please just let it go." I looked at him, laughter slipping from my lips, though there was no humor in my eyes. "So that's it. You bring her here, and then you tell people it was my idea. You made me the shield." Anthony flinched. His lips parted, but no explanation came. He couldn't deny it, and he couldn't defend it. I let out a cold laugh, the sound brittle. No matter what noble words he might use beneath it all, he was calculating, always weighing appearances, always protecting Claudia. I thought of his parents, of the debt I had once felt to them. Perhaps I had tolerated too much for their sake, but not anymore. That night, Anthony dragged his bedding to the living room floor, leaving me the bed. He must have thought it was a gesture of compromise, but to me it was nothing. At dawn, I woke before the sun, quickly packing my suitcase. I would find a hotel, any hotel, then return later for the rest of my belongings. As I opened the front door, the smell of cooking reached me. Anthony was in the kitchen again, plating breakfast. Faith spotted me first. She wrinkled her nose, pouted, and pushed her plate toward Claudia with a whine. "I don't want her food." She nudged the scrambled eggs farther from me, as though even proximity was contamination. Claudia said nothing, simply drew the plate closer to her side. Anthony stepped in, holding a pan. "Brooke, you're up. Come sit. I made eggs for you." He placed the dish in front of me with a hopeful smile, then turned to Faith, trying to soothe her. "Sweetheart, share a little with Brooke, okay?" But Faith crossed her arms, glaring at me with all the righteous fury of a child taught to despise. Claudia's delicate hand patted her back, and the two of them sat together, united in quiet defiance. I didn't respond. I didn't sit. I turned, lifted my bag, and walked out the door. There was only one shabby motel a block away, and I took the cheapest room they had. $21 for 3 nights, paid in advance with a deposit I could barely afford. The walls were thin, the bed lumpy, but I didn't care. It was mine. On the way back, I grabbed a bag of fried dough and a steamed bun from a breakfast stand, the smell of oil clinging to my clothes. I thought foolishly that maybe things would be quiet when I returned. Instead, I walked into chaos. My suitcase had been ripped open, clothes scattered across the floor, my carefully folded belongings, things I had treasured, were strewn about like trash, and there on the table, Faith sat swinging her legs, folding my college admission letter, the letter I had cradled in secret, as if it were my lifeline into paper airplanes. My mind went blank, the blood roaring in my ears. "What are you doing?" I shouted, rushing forward, yanking the letter from her small hands. Startled, she toppled backward off the table, landing with a wail that pierced the air. Tears came instantly, loud and theatrical. Within seconds, Claudia burst out of the bedroom, her eyes widening as if she had walked in on a crime scene. "What are you doing to her?" she screamed, rushing to scoop Faith into her arms. She shoved me hard enough that I stumbled. Cradling the girl protectively, she turned back to me with righteous fury. "How dare you lay a hand on her?" I trembled with rage, clutching the torn envelope to my chest, unfolding the admission letter with shaking fingers to make sure it wasn't ruined. Relief washed through me when I saw the words still intact. Then I lifted my head, my voice like ice. "She destroyed my things. Who gave you the right to touch what belongs to me? Get out." Claudia's lips curved into a mocking smile, her eyes glinting with triumph. She balanced Faith on her hip, her tone dripping with derision. "You're not even married to Anthony yet. Don't fool yourself into thinking you have any authority in this house." She carried Faith toward the door, her heels clicking against the floor. Just before stepping out, she turned back, her voice feather light, but her words like knives. "Even if you do marry him, you'll never win against me." The door slammed shut behind her, leaving the echo of her contempt to rattle in my chest. She had never bothered to hide her hostility, not when Anthony wasn't around. And for years, I had shrunk under it, too timid, too unsure of myself. She was beautiful, accomplished, the darling of the arts troupe. I had thought I could never compare, but rebirth had changed me. Why should I compare myself to her at all? In Anthony's heart, Claudia would always come first. But my life, my worth, did not revolve around him. I could study, I could grow, I could build a future beyond these suffocating walls. This apartment, this entanglement, was nothing more than a mire meant to keep me trapped. I gathered my things again, shoving what I could into my bag, then took a red pen and slashed a bold mark across the calendar. Each day was a countdown. Each day carried me closer to freedom. Slinging my backpack over my shoulders, I walked out without looking back, returning to the motel I had already rented. In the first days of my second chance, I had considered tearing everything apart, exposing Claudia, humiliating her before everyone in Anthony's unit. After all, she had destroyed me once before. Shouldn't I at least drag her down with me? But now, sitting on the sagging motel bed, I realized the futility. Even if I caused a scene, nothing would change. As long as Anthony remained, he would protect her. He would shield her, indulge her, raise her child as his own. What did she have to fear? The truth was simple. The problem wasn't Claudia. It was Anthony. I laughed bitterly to myself. Out of all his so-called brothers-in-arms, why was he the only one to step forward? Why had no one else taken on the role of protector, of benefactor, of father figure? He had chosen it. No one forced him. And for that, he had sacrificed me. With that thought, I pulled out paper and pen, steadying my hand. I began writing him a letter. I would set aside the years of misery that came after our marriage, set aside the bitterness that had burned me alive. I would only speak of the 3 years I had lived under his roof during high school, the years he had provided food and shelter, occasionally helped me with my studies. For that, I owed him at least an explanation. I wrote that I had returned to my hometown and broken the engagement. I told him plainly that I had been accepted into another university, and from this day forward, we would walk separate paths. There would be no ties between us, no obligations, no debts. I was halfway through the letter when a knock rattled the motel door. My hand froze mid-sentence. My first thought was that it must be the manager, perhaps, coming to check on the room. But when I opened the door, Anthony stood there breathless, his uniform rumpled, as though he had run across the city. His eyes swept over me, taking in the small room, the suitcase, the letter on the desk. Relief flooded his face, and his voice was rough, ragged. "Thank God, I found you." He stepped inside before I could stop him. "You're safe. That's all that matters." I tightened my grip on the doorframe, my pulse hammering. Safe. He had no idea what that word meant. When I opened the door, expecting the motel clerk, I froze. Anthony was standing there, his uniform disheveled, his breath uneven, as if he had run through the city searching for me. Relief flickered across his face the instant he saw me. "Thank God," he rasped, his voice rough, almost breaking. "I finally found you. You're safe. That's all that matters." I said nothing, bracing for his reproach, but instead he only sighed, his tone softening. "All right, don't be angry anymore. Come home with me." Without waiting, he stepped inside, reaching for my suitcase, as if to help me pack. I reacted instinctively, sliding my notebook across the desk to cover the half-written letter. But his eyes caught on something else, something I had failed to hide. His hand darted into my bag and pulled out the silver bracelet. "Why do you have this?" he demanded, his expression shifting instantly. My heart jolted. I cursed myself for not tucking it away more carefully. Faith got into my things earlier today and tore one of the bells off. I fixed it, that's all. It was the bracelet we had been given as children, the token of our engagement, something I had quietly retrieved when I went back to my hometown. Anthony stared at it, his face twisting with something unreadable. "This should be with my mother. Why is it here?" Before I could form an answer, He gave a short, incredulous laugh, as though the truth had just dawned on him. I get it. She must have asked you to bring it, right? That's what it is. He shoved it back into my bag, brushing off the significance. Keep it. We're practically married already. What's mine is yours. I exhaled quietly, hiding the storm inside me, my hand pressing down over the bag, as if guarding it. His brows furrowed as he studied me. What's wrong? Still upset? Faith crossed a line, but she's just a child. Don't stoop to her level. His voice hardened, almost accusing. Do you even realize what happened after you stormed off? Claudia was frantic. She ran out to look for you, fell, and scraped her knees bloody. She's lying at home now because of you. I can't understand it. Faith is usually so well behaved. Why is it that every time you're around there's conflict? I lifted my gaze, silent. He faltered at the coldness in my eyes, his words trailing away. Then I laughed low, bitter. Do you want to know what happened this afternoon? Your daughter, yes. Your daughter tore through my luggage, ripped open my things, and crumpled my admission letter into a toy. When I tried to stop her, Claudia told me I had no right to scold her. She looked me in the eye and said, even if I married you, I could never win against her. Tell me, Anthony, was she wrong? His face drained of color, his jaw tightening. She's not my daughter. She's my goddaughter. I ignored the denial, my voice sharpening like a blade. You've hidden behind the excuse of caring for your fallen comrade's family, but let's be honest. If he were watching from the grave, seeing you play house with his widow, would he rest easy? Or would his coffin rattle with shame? The words hit him like a blow. He staggered, his face ghostly pale, his lips opening and closing without sound. Finally, he forced out the words, each one heavy. If you won't come back now, fine, stay here. Think it over. I'll return in a few days. He turned then, almost stumbling in his haste to leave his back hunched under the weight of everything he refused to face. At the doorway, he stopped, his voice breaking with a strange desperation. I never betrayed you. I'll file the marriage registration as soon as I get back. And then he was gone, his hurried footsteps fading down the corridor. I stood in the silence he left behind, then shut the door with a cold final snap. To him, agreeing to marry me was a favor, a benevolent gift I was supposed to be grateful for. The thought made me laugh aloud, bitter and hollow. The next morning, I went to see Professor Jennings. He had anticipated my need, already securing a train ticket for me so I wouldn't be left without a seat. He had even written ahead to acquaintances in the Northwest, asking them to look after me until I found my footing. After lunch, I bought a few local specialties from the market, gifts for the roommates I would soon meet. That night, my last night before leaving, I lay in bed expecting restlessness, memories, doubts, the weight of farewells. But the moment my head touched the pillow, I sank into a deep, unbroken sleep. The next morning, I left the letter I had written at the front desk of the motel, settled my bill, and pulled my suitcase straight to the station. The 2 days on the train were a blur of rattling wheels and broken sleep. I drifted in and out of uneasy dreams, and by the time I stepped onto the platform at the end of the long journey, exhaustion weighed on me like a stone. Yet when I finally stood in front of the university gates and saw the sign, relief washed over me so completely that my knees nearly buckled. This was real. I was here. I completed my enrollment quickly, throwing myself headfirst into the demanding pace of study. In my past life, I had never even set foot inside a university classroom, never once breathed this air of books, chalk, and ambition. In this life, I swore to myself I would not waste the chance again. My days narrowed into a rhythm of lectures and long hours in the library. Eat, study, sleep, repeat. That was enough. 3 months passed before the first letter from Anthony arrived. I wasn't surprised he had found me. A month earlier, Professor Jennings had written to say that Anthony had tracked him down asking about me and learned where I had gone. So when the envelope appeared in my mailbox, I felt nothing but the heavy inevitability of it. He wrote that he would never accept our broken engagement, that he had always considered me his wife, that there was nothing between him and Claudia, that he had driven her out and promised never to see her again. He swore he would wait for me. Inside, he had enclosed $100. I folded the letter away without responding, the money I left untouched. My studies consumed me, but even with scholarships and top grades, life was financially suffocating. I searched for part-time work, but when Professor Jennings discovered what I was doing, he scolded me furiously in his next letter and began sending me $50 each month. He called it a loan, stressing again and again that I must treat it as such. At the end of his note, he added a rare touch of humor. "Don't worry, my wife knows. She fully supports helping you." For reasons I couldn't quite name, those words broke something inside me. In my previous life, no matter how desperate or trapped I was, I had never cried. I had fought, resented, despaired, but not once had I allowed myself tears. Yet now in this life, I thought would be harder and colder. I wept until my body shook like a dam finally bursting. My roommates rushed to comfort me, frightened by the sudden storm. When the sobs finally subsided, I wiped my face clean, and then I pushed forward with even more determination. Anthony wrote every month. Always the same assurances, the same $100 tucked inside the same insistence that he was waiting for me. In the last letter of the semester, he claimed he knew I would not want to return, but promised he would come to the Northwest to spend the new year with me. He never came. The letters stopped. Later, I learned the truth from Professor Jennings. Anthony had married Claudia. The professor's words were careful, deliberate, but each one cut deep. The news had stirred no small scandal. Anthony had submitted an application to transfer near me, but someone had reported him for inappropriate relations with a widow. Since I had already left, there was no victim for the accusation to attach to, and the matter was buried. But Claudia, the woman at the center of it, lost her position because of the fallout. With no other choice, Anthony married her. At the end of his letter, Professor Jennings wrote slowly, "My dear, you are fortunate beyond measure. Fortunate to have turned back time before you submitted your college choice. Fortunate to have escaped the mire of your previous life." He was right. A year later, another letter from Anthony arrived. The first line read, "I'm sorry." He confessed everything. That it had been Claudia who reported him. That she had begged him not to transfer, but he refused. That in desperation she had risked everything using her last weapon to bind him to her, and she had succeeded. He admitted that he hadn't understood until too late what those red marks on the calendar in the apartment had meant. He had thought they were the dates I longed to marry him. Only later did he realize they were the countdown to my freedom. I smiled as I read, but it was a smile without sorrow, without regret. I gathered every letter he had ever sent me, set them in a pile, and struck a match. The flames consumed them quickly, the words curling into ash. As for the money he had pressed upon me, I returned it all through Professor Jennings, asking him to distribute it among the students who needed it most. 2 years later, before I had even finished my degree, I joined the Great National Development Project, pouring my youth into work that built bridges, factories, and futures. From that moment forward, my life belonged not to Anthony, not to Claudia, not to the bitter mistakes of my past, but to something larger. I gave everything to my country, never once looking back, never once asking when I would return. And that finally was freedom. That day after Brooke left the apartment, fury and confusion swallowed me whole. I locked myself in my room for 3 straight days, drowning in silence, barely eating, barely breathing. For the first time in my life, I faced myself honestly and asked what I had done. The truth hit me like a bullet. I had betrayed her, long before I even realized it. Somewhere along the endless days of waiting for Brooke to grow up, somewhere in the tender moments of helping Claudia, somewhere in the laughter of her little girl Faith, my heart had shifted. I told myself it was duty, compassion, loyalty to a fallen brother, but deep down I knew it was weakness. And in that weakness, I lost the only woman who had ever truly been mine. Brooke was supposed to be my fiancé, my promise, my anchor. Yet I let another woman's gentleness and a child's innocent smile blur my path. I broke the vows I never even got to say, and the shame burned hotter than fire. After 3 days of torment, one thing became clear. I could not lose her. I would not lose her. I rushed to the boarding house where she had been staying, desperate to beg for forgiveness, but it was too late. She was gone, vanished like smoke, leaving me behind, without a trace. I scoured the city, questioned neighbors, haunted every corner of Manhattan, but no one knew where she had gone. Only when I found her professor did I learn the truth. She had gone west, far away to a university in the Northwest, chasing the future she deserved. My world collapsed in that instant. The silver bracelet I should never have let appear in her luggage flashed through my mind, and I realized everything I had misunderstood. I raced home only to be hit with the final blow. Brooke had officially broken off the engagement. I stumbled back to the house where we had lived together for 3 years, broken and drunk. That night I drowned myself in whiskey until the room spun and my vision blurred. Claudia slipped in quietly, her presence clinging like smoke. She found the transfer request I had written, the one that would have taken me closer to Brooke, and she went wild. She screamed, cried, tore at everything in sight. In her rage, she destroyed her own career, and her family came after me, demanding I make things right. Cornered, stripped of choices, I married her. From that moment on, the circle of people around me shrank. Friends who once stood by my side drifted away, disgusted with the scandal, weary of the chaos Claudia brought. I kept writing to Brooke, pouring my regrets into letter after letter, but she never replied. She had disappeared completely, leaving me to rot in the life I had chosen, or perhaps the life I had surrendered to. Claudia was relentless. After we married, she clung to me with a grip so suffocating it was hard to breathe. Every argument turned into a storm. Every chance I had to transfer closer to where Brooke might be, Claudia destroyed it. Each time it was the same, screaming, the same accusations. Do you want to leave me? Do you want to run back to her? And every time I swallowed the bitterness, the rage, the regret, and stayed. My parents never liked Claudia. They compared her to Brooke often, and though they never said it outright, the disappointment in their eyes was clear. That only made Claudia harsher, more paranoid, more unstable. Years passed and Claudia became someone I barely recognized. The sweet-faced widow I had once pitied turned into a woman consumed by jealousy and fear. She became extreme, quick-tempered, always ready to lash out. She wanted another child, but no matter how hard we tried, it never happened. All we had was Faith, her daughter, whom I raised as my own. Faith grew up married and had a child of her own, but her marriage was a disaster. Her husband was a gambler, a cheat, and worse, a violent man. Night after night, Claudia wept over her daughter's suffering, but when Faith begged for a divorce, Claudia refused. She insisted a broken marriage would ruin the family that Faith had to endure. Every time Faith came home with bruises, every time she was broken and bleeding, Claudia turned her fury on me. She screamed that if I had been more powerful, more successful, more like the man Brooke once believed I could be, Faith would have had a better life. Even Faith herself began to resent me. She spat words sharper than knives, telling me if I had been stronger, if I had climbed higher, maybe she would have been spared. I had nothing left to give them. I could only sit in silence, carrying the blame of every wrong, drowning in failures I could no longer fix. Faith eventually tried to run away, desperate to escape her husband's fists, but she was dragged back and beaten until she hovered between life and death. By then I was too old, too powerless, too broken to save her. And one day she ended it herself. My daughter, the girl I had raised, ended her own life. I laughed when I heard the news, but the sound that left my throat was hollow, empty, nothing more than the echo of a man who had lost everything. My laughter carried no joy, only the emptiness of someone who had already died inside. When I was old and frail, Faith was gone, Claudia was a shell of herself, and all that remained was a 6-year-old child, Faith's daughter, the only piece of her left behind. I took her in, raised her, watched her little hands clutch mine, and in her eyes I sometimes thought I saw Brooke. In those small, fleeting moments, memories flooded back of the girl I had once been promised to. The girl who had once trusted me with her whole heart. The girl I had failed. I asked myself over and over again, when did I truly lose her? Was it the day I let Claudia into our lives? Was it the day I ignored Brooke's tears and chose silence? Or was it long before when I convinced myself that pity and loyalty were the same as love? I could no longer remember. All I knew was that Brooke Evans had slipped away, and with her went every chance I ever had at redemption. Looking back now, my life feels like dust between my fingers. Empty, pointless, a series of mistakes that left me chained to a woman I never loved, haunted by the ghost of the one I let go. If only I had held on to Brooke. If only I had chosen differently. But life offers no second chances for men like me. She was my beginning, and losing her was the end of everything. And now all that remains is this silence, this regret, and the faint memory of a girl who once looked at me as if I were her whole world. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next videos.